I think that, like, in order to get some purchase on that question, you're going to have to zoom in and give some particular cases. When we're talking about settler colonial liberal democracies with those kinds of legacies of empire, the way that those problems with those democratic governments are going to express themselves are going to be different because they're different contexts. So if we're looking to be too general and trying to lump them all together and diagnose problems that cross across, I think we're going to be kind of boggled. Like, we're not going to be able to see properly what we're talking about. We're going to be too high a level of abstraction. I would say that if there are some commonalities that sort of go across from, let's say, Western European liberal democracies currently involved in the EU in some degree, and North America and Oceania, so including Australia and New Zealand. Part of the problem is borrow a word from, or a concept/phrase from Habermas, the crisis of legitimacy, is that these democratic institutions are predicated on the idea that their legitimacy comes from the self-determining power of peoples through constitutionalism and the rule of law. And that there has been a imbalance in the relationship between that legitimating principle and the development of administrative power, for lack of a better word, the development of the executive state. Right? That's a long-standing tension. Goes back to the very foundation of the administrative state. But its mode of expression has gotten more pronounced as globalization as a trend has increased, and elites within countries that are running governments begin to network with one another and see the process of governance as a process of management, right? Managing populations and taking their legitimacy institutions for granted. As long as people can vote in certain cycles, everything is fine, it's legitimate. But as the neoliberal agenda of allowing corporate relocation of labor has progressed, you see a kind of hollowing out, because now the economics of that arrangement, the economics of the middle class that votes, that understands in some way, shape, or form the system, has shifted, and their economic condition has worsened, and they have seen no opportunities or levers to challenge or contest that within the current frame. They begin to see the current frame as a trap. And they begin to see it as not a reflection of their will. And so you begin to see a loosening of their relationship to the state. And that, I think, is what Habermas had in mind in the 1970s when he wrote the book, The Crisis of Legitimacy. And that early diagnosis has only gotten more and more pronounced. And so when we get to the phase of left-right populism reactions, I think when we're talking about populism, we're really just talking about crises of legitimacy and contesting the established modes of how those are generated, and people shifting and moving towards different modes of attacking that. I would see the connections as really the underlying contest between rule by law systems and rule of law systems. So rule by law systems are command and control administrative bureaucracies like the executive state and corporate entities, right? They have a similar structure and design, but very different principles. They're bound by different laws, right? Corporate entities have private law. They don't have that kind of responsibility that's wider across the social environment. And so they exist within a context that they kind of take for granted, whereas the administrative state has begun to borrow more and more corporate forms of management, but lost track of its actual constitutional responsibilities and lifeblood, right? And so that imbalance between rule by law as an administrative form, or prerogative power, as they would have called it in the 19th century, and constitutionalism, or the ancient constitution, if you put it in the sort of British common law context, is something that was fought out in terms in the 19th century, but continues to express itself in different ways now. So if we want to look at different mechanisms for response, part, at least coming from the Canadian settler colonial context, is to look at the resilience of modes of governance within Indigenous communities that have survived 150 years of the administrative state not being tethered by so much of the constitutional constraints that it has in its relationships with its citizens and subjects. And after all, Indians were wards, creatures of statute, pretty much governed as the state saw fit, right? And that changed over time. But the fact that Indigenous political and legal systems were able to survive that kind of onslaught and in fact resurge into the current frame and strengthen themselves means that they have a lot to teach Western liberal democracies about the practices of self-rule. That self-rule isn't limited to the Western European liberal frame or democratic tradition, that there are other modes of doing self-government, if that's what we're talking about when we talk about democracy, is self-government. I think that's the most transcendental expression of what we mean when we say those words, and why they have purchase on other peoples who don't come from a tradition that goes back to Athens, right, in the Western European tradition. Why they want something along those lines has to do with self-rule and the ability to influence the rules that govern your life. So I think finding points of dialogue that recognize that the old civilizational measuring stick that was used to delegitimate and dehumanize Indigenous peoples and their systems of government, that they weren't up to standing in relationship to British parliamentary democracy, has to be thrown out, because right now British parliamentary democracy is suffering from the disease that they tried out over here, which is unmitigated administrative governance. The funny thing about it is, in a certain sense, the promise of the 19th century was that Indians Indians being a creature of the state, being defined by the state, not Indigenous peoples, but Indians, as something that was legislated into existence, and then shrunk down in terms of their legislative, or like their legal rights, right, to the level of wards, the sort of one of the smallest units of legal personhood. The promise of that whole system that tried to legitimate it was that was just pedagogical, that you'd be trained on how to be citizens over time. And so everyone would be citizens eventually. Everyone would be adults. This was just an interim project. So citizen was the model, Indian was the training wheels to move in that direction. And so despotism would bring you there. By being subject to the administrative state, you'd learn, right? But the funny thing is, the inverse has occurred. In the 20th century, as time goes on with the administrative state, it learns mechanisms on how to handle subjects by dealing with a set of subjects it creates, Indians. And it begins to apply those to citizens. So instead of Indians becoming citizens, citizens begin to become Indians. They begin to lose their rights. They begin to become more and more subject to state-based authority, without accountability and without mechanisms of recourse through the Constitution. So this transformation begins to occur, and we can see it very clearly in things like enemy combatant as a concept, right, in the United States. So that's used to label a set of people terrorists, right, and remove them from the Geneva Convention, remove them from any kind of legal limitation that would have limited state power. So you create, by statute, another category. Well, that's how Indians were created. You create a category and make them exceptional. And then you can apply as much force as you'd like, because you've created a new category, right? Prisoners suffer from this as well, right? In the administrative power that the state exercises over them, they have an exceptional set of rights that are constitutional light. They get watered down, right? So do immigrants, aliens, right? So these are where the administrative state exercises its highest degree of powers, but as they exercise more powers there, the citizen gets more and more watered down.